Today I'm going to tell you about the 5 deadliest cults in history, and the deranged details are even more disturbing than you think. If you enjoy hearing provocative stories told through a dark and humorous lens, we're about to spend a lot of quality time together. I found some obscure information I think you'll find pretty interesting. So hit the thumbs up like it owes you money, and let's get down to business. The Order of the Solar Temple was founded in 1984 by a pair of diabolically despicable human pustules. Joseph DeMambro was a 70-year-old French-Canadian who spent 6 months in a French jail in 1972 for posing as a psychologist, and Luc Jouret, a 46-year-old Belgian who claimed to be the third reincarnation of Jesus Christ. And being a third-string Jesus, he required sexual escapades with women before conducting ceremonies, claiming they gave him the spiritual strength to do his holy duties. Did I or did I not tell y'all that cult leaders always have a weird sex thing? They joined evil forces and started the Solar Temple by combining survivalist ideas, evangelical Christianity, and New Age beliefs, and they drew inspiration from groups like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and the Knights Templar. Followers believed they would be reborn on a planet orbiting the star Sirius. Being part of this group would re-establish authority and power in the world. The elders of the Solar Temple held lodge ceremonies and secret rituals, wearing long robes with hoods. It's like I always say, before you rob people, you got a hood. No, seriously, they were robbing people. And at one point, several cult members confronted DeMambro and demanded to know how he was spending their cold hard cash. A search of his luxury mansion in Geneva turned up 4 red Ferraris and a Lamborghini, so they definitely got their answer. A report by Radio Canada lightly alleged that DeMambro had used the cult as a front for international trafficking in small arms and using real estate transactions to launder $95 million. DeMambro asserted his cult dominance by claiming his son was conceived through theogamy, or marriage with the gods, and that his daughter was conceived immaculately, like Mary's pregnancy with Jesus Christ. Putting your dipstick into every pop socket and then telling folks your child was immaculately conceived is some seriously sacrilegious shit. In 1994, 2 cult members were found brutally murdered, allegedly on DeMambro's orders. Antonio and Nikki Dutoit and their 3-month-old son, Emmanuel, were all savagely killed because DeMambro was convinced that this tiny little baby was the literal Antichrist. DeMambro's evil fabrication was born entirely out of anger that the Dutoits had named their child the same name as one of his own godlike children. He somehow convinced followers that the only way to kill the Antichrist was to stab it 666 times. Look at this. How do you see those cheeks and think this is the Antichrist? With all due disrespect, I'm starting to wish that a burning lake of fire actually did exist, because DeMambro could put on a concrete suit and I would personally escort him to the deepest end of that lake. The cult's plan for their mass transition accelerated faster than a Lambo can go 0 to 100, which is 2.9 seconds if you're curious. DeMambro's son Ellie began questioning the organization and became vocal about his suspicions regarding the legitimacy of beliefs being taught by his dad. He told members that visions presented to the members were actually holograms and special effects faked by his dad, which prompted several people to quit the cult and for Ellie to walk away from the family business. Reports also show that a man named Tony had recently admitted to other members that he had helped install mechanisms in a lodge to trick members into thinking they were witnessing miracles. Damn it, Tony! This was obviously a huge blow to DeMambro's credibility, but an even bigger blow to his already engorged ego. Shortly after the truth came to light, 2 Solar Temple buildings in Switzerland went up in flames. Authorities found 48 bodies of men, women, and children inside. Some shot, some with bags over their heads, and some had been injected with tranquilizers. They were arranged in a crude circle, feet towards the center, wearing red and black or white and gold ceremonial robes, and some had their hands tied behind their backs. The place had also been booby-trapped with 100 gallons of gasoline wired to clocks to set off. But the ticks didn't talk correctly, and so it never exploded as planned. Authorities originally called this a mass suicide, but Ellie's body was found among the deceased. I can't imagine he was a true willing participant in his own unaliving, considering the preceding circumstances. Joseph DeMambro and the rest of his family were found among the dead next to his personal weapon, but unfortunately the death toll would continue to rise. In the days and weeks following, a Solar Temple building in the Swiss Alps was burned down with 16 bodies inside, 5 more in a burned down house in Quebec, bringing the total number of casualties to 74. So where the hell is Jouret in all of this? It was reported that he was a casualty of the mass suicide, but authorities actually refused to confirm his death. It's been widely speculated that Joe pulled a Heisman and stiff-armed death, going underground to launder millions of those dead people's money. Here's a super unfun fact. 6 months before the group's mass departure, the tragic events in Waco, Texas Texas stole the temple's theatrical thunder. During their investigation, the Swiss police found an audio cassette between DeMambro and Jouret, indicating their intent to carry out a spectacular event similar to the Waco siege. Now, I would say it for you in French as it was originally spoken, but I was homeschooled in a cult in Arkansas and learned approximately zero French, so I'll save us both the painful experience, but here's the conversation translated in English. People have beaten us to the punch, you know. Well, yeah, Waco beat us to the punch. In my opinion, we should have gone 6 months before them. What we'll do will be even more spectacular. Beat them to the punch? Pardon my French, but I would like to beat punch both of these douchebagettes from sea to shining sea, or at least to Texas, Waco, Texas. In 1993, David Koresh's lifelong series of subpar decisions would ultimately require his Kansa to meet his Quinces, resulting in the longest shootout in America's law enforcement history. Before David Koresh was David Koresh, the prolific cult leader of the Branch Davidians, he was simply Vernon Wayne Howell. His mom was only 15 when she gave birth to him in Houston, Texas, and he would later trauma dump on federal negotiators how he was teased relentlessly by kids who wouldn't stop calling him Vernie. He struggled in school partly due to dyslexia, but despite early difficulties, he managed to memorize massive chunks of the Bible, which led him to join the Branch Davidians when he was 22. Now, this sect of Branch Davidians was a breakoff from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They believed that the Bible was the literal word of God and that the prophecies in the book of Revelation would be fulfilled, and non-believers would be punished and believers would be rewarded. At the time Vernie joined, the group was led by prophetess Lois Roden and her son George. But when Lois died, Vernie wasted no time flushing his morals straight down the poop chute. He challenged Lois's son George for control of the Davidian sect and made it abundantly clear that in his world, violence was the answer. He rolled up to the Waco compound with 7 heavily armed followers, and wouldn't you know it, people died. Well, George died. Vernie and the homicidal 7 were charged with attempted murder, and although Vernie led the bloodthirsty pack, his case resulted in a mistrial. He apparently told the jury that they had aimed at a tree, but somehow the bullets from 8 men just happened to hit George. Once he was off the homicidal hook, he changed his name to David Koresh. Then he took his rightful place on Thundercunt throne as the crowned king of Shitsylvania. The devil shits and his army eats. Koresh required total authority and submission from all Branch Davidians, and anyone who wanted to leave the compound had to undergo an exit interview so he could make sure they damn well knew that to abandon him was to abandon their salvation. And right on schedule, here comes the weird sex thing. When David was in his mid-20s, he married a 14-year-old girl named Rachel, who was the daughter of a loyalist. In the middle of the night, David went to her dad Perry and informed him that he needed Rachel. Instead of reporting this pedophile to the authorities, Perry woke Rachel up in the middle of the night and sent her with David. Not long after their marriage, David announced that God wanted him to have multiple wives because according to scripture, his job was to sire 24 children to rule the kingdom of God. But ultimately, he fell short of that goal because he only had 16. Rookie numbers, David. He required all women of childbearing age to become his wife, including Rachel's younger sister Michelle, and girls as young as 12. But even that wasn't enough. David began annulling all marriages of couples within the group, which meant the women could only have sex with him now for procreation purposes, and husbands couldn't so much as observe the pantyhosed ankle of their legally wed wives. These men were lucky though, according to David, because without a wife to distract them, they could finally spend more time studying the Bible and become more worthy of God's love. And apparently God told David he wanted him to have the only air-conditioned unit in the entire Mount Carmel compound. I guess the Lord was working in some mysterious triple-digit Texas summer heat kind of way. In case the heat from David's gaslighting wasn't enough, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or the ATF, came to Mount Carmel to investigate allegations that the Branch Davidians were stockpiling firearms, which they were doing, by the way. But that's when it turned violent. There's major controversy over who fired the first shots that day, but 10 people ended up dead, including Perry, Rachel's dad. And that's what set off the 51-day Waco siege. And for the next 51 days, feds negotiated with Koresh. The feds delivered cartons of milk for Davidian children, but planted bugs in the cartons to gather intelligence. They used psychological warfare tactics like cutting off water and electricity to the compound, then blasting loud music and floodlights at all hours of the night to prevent sleep and cause upset in both adults and children. Negotiators were able to eventually remove a total of 35 people from the compound, including 21 children, but according to David, most of the followers didn't want to leave his side. Branch Davidians believed that the siege was part of the, quote, fifth seal, which stated that they were expected to suffer 2 rounds of bloodshed separated by a long pause. They saw that day in February as the first round of bloodshed, and they expected another one to follow shortly after, and they weren't wrong. On April 19th, the FBI used an army tank tank to punch holes in the walls of the compound, then began pouring tear gas through the windows and the walls. Within 6 hours, 3 massive fires broke out across Mount Carmel. No one can fully agree if it was the Davidians or the feds that actually started the fire. Some say kerosene lanterns were knocked over, causing the tear gas to spark, but some think the fires were ordered by Koresh based on some milk carton audio from that day. Regardless, the fire caused a massive destruction, leaving a total of 76 Branch Davidians dead, including all 25 remaining children inside. Only 9 adults escaped the fire. Koresh and his right-hand man were found with fatal head wounds, indicating either suicide or murder-suicide. However, it's widely speculated that the majority of Waco members did not die as part of a suicide pact. In fact, most of the women and children were found deceased in an underground concrete bunker that was filled with weapons, but all of them had died from smoke inhalation, meaning they had probably gone in there thinking that they would be safe, and unfortunately, they weren't. As if the events in Waco weren't tragic enough, it went on to serve fucked up inspiration for the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in our entire American history. During the 51-day siege, 24-year-old Army veteran Timothy McVeigh spent his days only 3 miles from Mount Carmel observing the standoff. He used this opportunity to sell anti-government and pro-gun merch to the growing crowds and used the Davidians' colossal shitbag leader to inspire his own quest for prolific shitbaggery. So congratulations, I guess, to both Timothy and David for securing their spots in our shit-stained history, and they owe trees an apology for wasting all of that oxygen. This modern-day cult is responsible for one of the most horrific mass murder-suicides in our lived history. The Good News International Church originally hailed from Malindi, a city located in Kenya, and its Kenyan leader knows all about hailing things. Before Pastor Paul McKenzie began his full-time brainwashing career in 2003, he spent years of his life driving a taxicab. How the hell does one go from driving a taxicab to having the blood of over 400 people on their hands? If there's one thing I've learned about cult leaders, it's that they're not really good at creating new tactics. It's one of those, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of things. Paul McKenzie gained a decent-sized cult following by convincing people he had a personal connection and could communicate directly with God. His teachings were heavily influenced by the end-time message of William Branham and oneness Pentecostalism. He used doomsday fear tactics to gain loyalty among followers because, here in the cultiverse, loyalty and dollar signs go hand in hand. One member sold his property for 20 million Kenyan shillings and gave it all to McKenzie, which is roughly $152,000. Allegedly, the money was used to purchase chunks of land, vehicles, and fund a radio station so Paul could broadcast his brainwashing to the masses. This generous donation convinced other followers to sell their possessions and donate all of the money to the church. In the years leading up to his current incarceration, spoiler alert, he's in jail, McKenzie was arrested multiple times on suspicion of radicalization. He was charged in 2 separate cases for a variety of fuckery, like running an unauthorized school and television station, inciting children to abandon school, denouncing education as being ungodly, and also denying children access to healthcare. Sadly, children did die as a result from this lack of healthcare, and in 2017, government officials rescued 93 children from the McKenzie's church. But despite all of these concerning charges, McKenzie was acquitted from one case in 2021. The other case was dropped. In 2019, he was once again charged with abducting and brainwashing children for his group, so him and hundreds of his followers packed up and moved to the Shakahola forest to prepare for the end of the world. Let's fast forward to April of last year. Police raided McKenzie's 800-acre forest compound after a man filed a missing persons report for his wife and daughter, who had left to join the Doomsday Cult and never returned. Authorities went to the commune expecting to find 2 missing bodies and were instead met with an overwhelming stench of human decay as hundreds of bodies lay rotting in shallow mass graves all across the property, and even more bodies lay decomposing above ground. Authorities were able to rescue 15 people from the compound immediately, but because of their extreme and emaciated condition, 4 of them died before medical personnel could even reach the hospital. Later on, another victim was taken to the hospitals when authorities discovered that they had been buried alive for 3 full business days. And that's when the dark realization really began to set in. This was not an accident. This cult was killing hundreds of adults and children, and killing them through intentional means of torture and violence. But how did this even happen? According to survivor and witness reports, followers believed that starvation was their ticket to heaven. And you'll never guess what Humpty Dumpty looking motherfucker told him that. McKenzie deployed extreme indoctrination and manipulation tactics to convince followers that starvation was the required price for salvation. McKenzie told followers that the fast would only count if they were gathered together, so he offered them his farm as a fasting venue. Mackenzie split the community into 8 separate settlements with biblical names like Galilee and Bethlehem, because everyone knows abuse is okay as long as you slap a biblical label on it. Autopsy reports revealed that most victims died from starvation, but many others died violently by suffocation, strangulation, and blunt force trauma. Officials reported that Mackenzie had hired criminals that were armed with crude weapons to kill the followers who changed their minds and wanted out, as well as those who were taking too long to die from starvation. I don't know exactly what Jesus would do, but I'm fairly confident that he wouldn't be signing off on this barbaric Dark Ages type of fuckery. Hundreds of followers slowly starved and killed their children, then starved and killed themselves. So this human equivalent of a wet band-aid was at least practicing what he was preaching, right? Wrong. During their search, police found a weekly menu taped right next to Mackenzie's bed because he had been stuffing his hypocritical gullet the entire time. Isolating themselves turned out to be a massive part of the group's morbid success. Members were told not to mingle with anyone from the outside world if they wanted to go to heaven, and to destroy all documents given by the government, including national IDs, birth certificates, and marriage certificates. This presented a massive problem, because once authorities began exhumations on 800 acres of mass graves, they could not identify the fragmented bones and flesh that used to be people. In January of 2024, Mackenzie and 30 other defendants were officially charged with the murder of 191 children. Out of 191 children, 180 still remain unidentified, largely in part to the intentional destruction of those identifying documents. So even at minimum, 180 children remain nameless, faceless, and lifeless. According to the latest report, the Shakahola death count has reached 429, and of the 429 bodies found, only 34 positive DNA matches have been made. The entire scale of the tragedy remains uncertain, as exhumations by forensic experts and volunteers are still ongoing. Officials expect the number to increase by several hundred before body recovery is complete. After Mackenzie and his evil brute squad were finally arrested in 2023, authorities then proceeded to jail 64 of his victims because they refused to eat or drink out of loyalty to Mr. Rotten Potato Head. If you haven't lost all faith in humanity by this point in the story, you're about to set that shit free. Prosecutors proceeded to charge those same 64 brainwashed victims sitting in jail next to their murderous abuser with attempted suicide. They just escaped a doomsday cult and are barely clinging to life, and you throw them in jail and charge them with crimes. They're prioritizing the wrong slammer. Certain somebody whose name rhymes with Schmackenzie has decided to not participate in the hunger strike with his followers. You'd think with the mounting evidence against Schmackenzie, including, the 429 bodies, he would perhaps show a teeny bit of remorse or maybe acknowledge his role in the massacre. Pastor Paul didn't, and Pastor Paul won't, because Pastor Paul doesn't have a goddamn clue what you're talking about.
What happened in the forest with your followers?
I can tell nothing about that because I've been in custody for 2 months. So I don't know what is going outside there. Have you been there?
The people before you were in custody, people were starving, and there are allegations that people were killing their children.
But I've never seen anybody starving, even killing his or her children.
Honestly, I'm not sure what I expected from a complete imbecile like Paul Mackenzie, but all hail the king of human crap sacks. Speaking of human crap sacks, James Warren Jones is the Mac Daddy of them all. On November 18, 1978, in a remote jungle compound in Guyana, Jones and his inner circle orchestrated one of the most horrific mass murder-suicide events in history, claiming the lives of 914 adults and children. The phrase "drink the Kool-Aid" was derived from the events of Jonestown and has really become a symbol of blind loyalty and unquestioning obedience to authority. But it wasn't actually Kool-Aid that day that the people of Jonestown drank. The deplorable actions of the People's Temple had a global impact on how society viewed cults then and now. Have you ever met somebody and just knew that they weren't loved as a child? In this case, that unloved child is Jim Jones. He was born in 1931 to a neglectful mother and a daddy in the KKK. Having physically and emotionally absent parents causes many children to create imaginary worlds and develop vivid imaginations to escape the reality, which is especially true for little Jimmy Jones. He often made delusional claims as a form of escapism, such as claiming he could fly, and he actually yeeted himself off the top of a building in front of a crowd of people to prove it, which only proved, unfortunately, he could not. He developed an obsession from an early age with religion and death, and he would host mock funerals for roadkill at the local funeral home. And when he couldn't find roadkill that was readily available for these ceremonies, He would create them. He also loved a good sacrilegious prank or crime. He claimed to have stolen the Pentecostal pastor's Bible and covered it in cow shit. And supposedly he swapped the holy water at the Catholic Church with his own urine. He really loved dropping the shock factor of profanity as a little kid by greeting people with things like, "Good morning, you son of a bitch," or "Hello, you dirty bastard." All I can think of is Ricky Bobby's Sons in Talladega Nights.
Shut up, Chip, or I'll go ape shit on your ass. Chip, I'm gonna come at you like a spider monkey.
The early childhood red flags were flying at full mast, but his parents were committed to ignoring his weird obsessions, even when he developed an intense interest in Stalin, Karl Marx, and especially Hitler and the Nazi army's ability to power over others. Jones would even act as a dictator over children, ordering them to goose step together and beating those who disobeyed. Can you imagine rolling up to the park and witnessing baby Hitler training a baby Nazi army? In his own chilling words, he admitted, "I was ready to kill by the end of 3rd grade. I mean, I was so aggressive and hostile, I was ready to kill. Nobody gave me love or understanding, and unfortunately, Jimmy's teen years were just as lonely." But he did end up coaching youth sports for a bit, which is where he first started noticing the blatant discrimination against the black community. In 1949, at 18 years old, Jim married a woman named Marceline. It came as a shock to absolutely no one that being a total shitbag husband came pretty naturally to him. After idolizing the supremely worst dictators in history, he started practicing sadistic psychological warfare tricks on his new wife. More than once, he would test her loyalty by telling her that a family member had suddenly died. And during her initial moments of just absolute grief and overwhelm, he would hold and comfort her before telling her it wasn't true at all. I'm just gonna say it. I'm glad this bag of fucknuts is dead. But every night I wish upon 100 shooting stars that it had happened a hell of a lot sooner. Anyway, these toxic lovebirds would end up spawning one biological child and adopting 8 more. The Joneses put down roots in San Francisco, opening a Pentecostalish church called the People's Temple, often referred to as Jonestown. Jim preached messages of economic socialism and racial equality, which was honestly a refreshing take, especially to young students and racial minorities. He became an outspoken civil rights activist and used his spiritual position and fancy clergyman title to gain the trust of the black community, while secretly and strategically exploiting those same communities for personal and financial gain. Then Jones came in contact with another leader named Father Divine and adopted his heavy-handed controlling practices for the People's Temple. And the church continued to gain traction after Jim appeared in campaigns with prominent Pentecostal leaders and was personally endorsed by Pentecostal faith healer William Branham. Anyone else experiencing Kenyan deja vu right now? Jones embraced many aspects of Branham's techniques and teachings, like claiming to be Christ the Revolution, a modern-day Elijah, and of course, screaming hellfire and brimstone, warning of an impending apocalypse. Y'all think I should cover this Branham character in his own separate video? Because he seems to be the OG influencer for so many of these shitty influencers. I wonder if that makes heathens like me a sinfluencer. Jones relied heavily on fear when it came to indoctrinating his followers, saying he received a prophecy of an impending nuclear race war. He claimed to be the Messiah, sent to rescue them, and accepting his teachings were the only way to gain salvation. He concealed his communist beliefs in the US to avoid jeopardizing support from political leaders, and of course he didn't want to lose the church's tax-exempt status. Money isn't the root of all evil, unless it's other people's money. While operating his cult in the confines of California, Jim Jones had an absolute payday on the political scene. He used his charisma, that's Riz if you're Gen Z, to influence and manipulate the public in order to gain more power and money. By the late 1960s, reports of abuse within the temple began to emerge publicly. Followers lived in isolated church communes, giving their income and property to the temple and giving up all individuality and choice. Jimothy Jones got settled in real nice into his long-desired role of religious dictator and promptly reverted to the twisted shit of his youth. This inhumane behemoth of a monster instructed temple leaders to shoot the pets of all the members and then just dump them in a mass grave. Then he had the audacity and caucasity to say it was due to the size constraints of the commune, as if that somehow justified or forgave the slaughtering of family pets. After moving to California, Jim also developed a drug dependency to painkillers, and eventually moved up to amphetamines and phenobarbitals, which would cause him to experience extreme paranoia. Recreational drug use was prohibited for cult members, but being a sanctimonious, self-righteous snake, Jones had no problem utilizing drugs as a tool to control his followers. Non-compliant members were frequently subdued with tranquilizers, and even Jones' own children were exposed to the drugs he left accessible. And here comes his his weird sex thing. He controlled the sex life and marriage choices among members, and even coerced some people to have abortions. He also demanded sexual favors from members' wives, and even raped some of the male congregants. Those who opposed him faced punishment, such as food rations being cut, increased workloads, public humiliation, and physical violence. Jones required all of the children to be raised communally, with an extra emphasis on physical discipline. Children endured repeated paddlings in front of temple members, and disciplinary boxing matches where they would purposely be outmatched by one or more cult members, and eventually the adults were also included in the paddlings and boxing matches. And Jones intentionally designed these things to inflict both mental humiliation and physical pain. I guess being such a shit human also made him paranoid, and I'm sure the drugs didn't help. So he created an armed security group to help maintain control within the temple. Jones required that the adults sign papers admitting to crimes, including conspiracy among the US government and molesting their own children, which of course provided the perfect blackmail for when members tried to leave. A page right out of L. Ron Hubbard's book. Ironically, or perhaps not, the Church of Scientology was founded only 5 years before, so there was definitely an opportunity for some cross-pollinating. In 1974, Jones got real fed up with all of the negative media attention and the mounting allegations of abuse, so that's when he began transitioning the Jonestown commune to Guyana, South America. And when I say transitioning, followers, I mean he coerced and lied to them. He was able to pull it off by proclaiming that this new location was a socialist utopia liberated from US government oppression, which of course we now know was a lie of Leviathan proportions. This move served to further isolate and trap these people in an unfamiliar country, so Jones could access an uninhibited amount of control, and he could pull it off without an ounce of accountability. Jones' paranoia escalated in Jonestown, leading to the implementation of White Knight drills, where he simulated attacks on the commune in order to instill fear in the followers, and had guards surround the commune with guns and crossbows. These drills reinforced the belief that the CIA sought to destroy the community. Jones exploited these fears further, staging mock suicides. During one White Night, Jones announced to his followers that he would distribute poison juice for a revolutionary suicide. Everyone in the pavilion, including children, were given a cup of poison juice to drink. Then they all sat together crying and waiting to die, only to be informed later that it was just a test of their loyalty and the drink was not actually poison. The conditions really started to go downhill when members were so overworked, hungry, and subjected to sleep deprivation nonstop. Jones' erratic behavior and false claims, including feigning cancer, added to the atmosphere of fear and control. According to a former member, Jones said to him, "Let's keep them poor and tired, because if they're poor they can't escape, and if they're tired they can't make plans." Despite his declining health and drug abuse, Jones maintained a grip on his followers. Some followers were kept in coffin-shaped boxes underground, while the other members had to constantly berate them for any slight Jim perceived against the cult. In 1977, disturbing accounts from Jonestown started blowing up in the US media. Reports of beatings, blackmail, human rights violations, and claims of involuntary confinement prompted U.S. Representative Leo Ryan to investigate the claims further. The congressman went to Guyana with a delegation of government officials and journalists to investigate the allegations of Jonestown abuse. When it was time for them to leave Jonestown, they took 15 members who had expressed a desire to leave, but they were ambushed on the way by armed members of the People's Temple. They assassinated Ryan and 4 other people right there on the airstrip. And that's what kicked Jim's paranoia into overdrive. He assumed the surviving officials would immediately alert authorities, and the government would come back and slaughter all of the people of Jonestown. So he decided that he would rather kill them all and die himself, rather than hand over a single drop of power and control. For years, he had been getting high on his own supply by siphoning this submission and blind obedience from vulnerable members, and he had to taste that delicious high one more time. Jones called the group together for another White Night, but this time it wasn't a drill, and he would record 45 minutes of horror, which is now known as the death tape. Over 900 people lined up and were given a death cocktail of Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid, and cyanide. Parents were instructed to administer the mixture to their children first, and those who refused to drink were injected with cyanide by syringe. Armed guards surrounded the group and were told to shoot anyone who attempted to leave, giving the members a grim choice. When members cried and showed signs of dissent, Jones instructed them to stop the hysterics and told people they had to die with some dignity. In this chilling audio, Jones can be heard saying,
"A handful of our people, with their lives, have made our life impossible. They're all laying out their dead. If we can't live in peace, then let's die in peace. I tell you, I don't care how many screams you hear. I call on you to quit exciting your children when all they're doing is going to quiet rest. Get in, folks, it's easy.
Jim Jones was later found with a bullet in his head and enough phenobarbital in his system to kill a non-addict. His wife, Marceline Jones, also died that day, but there might be a plot twist. I stumbled across some harrowing details of her life and death written by her surviving son, Stephen, which gave me so much more context to the events of that day and explained specific things heard in that morbid audio. But it's also pretty dark. However, if you're a freak like me and you still want to hear it, I will drop everything into Patreon. 85 people survived the massacre, including 3 of the Joneses' sons who were out of town with the People's Temple basketball team, because even when you're in a cult, ball is still life. When Jim Jones's reign of terror finally ended, over 900 people, including 276 children, were forced to die, making it the single greatest loss of American civilian life until September 11th, 2001. If you're standing, have a seat, because the insane amount of head scratching and spinning could very well turn your brain cells into a DJ. Being a lifelong anemic, I enjoy stories with a periodic element of irony, and it really doesn't get more ironic than naming your bloodthirsty cult the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God, when thou shalt not kill is literally number 6. The Restoration Movement was founded in Uganda in 1989, and to my knowledge, no, this woman was not Taylor Swift. It was Miss Credonia, also known as the Programmer. Credonia climbed the top 5 charts into the number 1 spot because she can do anything a man can do, but she's also gonna make it violently worse. I don't usually feel afraid or intimidated by women, but guys, this bitch scares the flying flamingo fuck out of me. And she's alive. That's right, she's out there hiding in the shadows somewhere, alive and free, so good luck sleeping tonight. Before founding a cult with such an unnecessarily long name, she dabbled in prostitution and brewed banana beer at her bar, which isn't a metaphor, believe it or not. It's hard to find much information about Credonia's early life, except by all accounts, she was a pyromaniac with a lust for money and vindictive violence. Exhibits A, B, C, and D. In her 20s, she felt slighted by a local official, so she torched everything in his house. A few years later, she seduced a man who was traveling through, killed him while he slept, and then pocketed the cash. When customers came by her house the next morning to purchase beer, she was casually scrubbing the man's blood off her concrete. When a family member refused to join her cult years later, she burned his plantain plantation into crispy little chips. Mysteriously, her 3 brothers died, one right after the other, which means she had no choice but to become the sole owner of her own banana plantation. And that would later become the stomping grounds for her cult. And when her bar went broke, she converted to a religion known for its enthusiastic approval of alcohol, the Roman Catholic Church. While hanging out in a cave, as one does, she claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary. We can collectively agree that there were mushrooms in that cave, right? The Virgin Vision was the inspiration Credonia needed to begin her prolific and hair-raising rampage. She did, however, enlist the help of several men to build her apocalyptic cult, because even the cuntivore herself couldn't ignore the fact that a certain level of societal credibility relies on a patriarchal presence. Labeling herself a prophetess and priestess, she went on the prowl for a sanctified sugar daddy. After meeting Mr. Joseph, the headmaster of a respectable Catholic boarding school, she suddenly received another vision, or what she called a program, from the Virgin Mary. The program said that Joseph would be the one helping Credonia restore the 10 Commandments on this super important mission. Being a devout Catholic, Joseph was really flattered by his obviously important role in the Savior's scheme. So Credonia moved in with him and his family, and for the next 3 years, they kicked it. Until they kicked her out for doing some very unvirgin things with Joseph, beating the shit out of his wife, and lighting all of her clothes on fire. And this fucking guy left his wife to follow crazy Credonia right to her new compound, where she named him the cult leader of this movement, mainly so she could capitalize on his credibility of being a man and a man of faith. I guess I kind of get it, because former banana brewer and murderous prostitute probably don't carry the same respectability. These two partnered up with other defrocked priests and nuns, and the group quickly grew into thousands of members, which lived in the dozens of various commune outposts. The community was required to follow the 10 Commandments, and those requirements were strictly enforced by a team of brutal men. The group believed that the apocalypse would occur on December 31st, 1999, and following this strict way of life was the only way to avoid damnation. As a result, damn near everything was forbidden, including sex and soap. Members were woken up at 3 o'clock every morning to pray for 2 hours, fasted 2 days a week, and were fed next to nothing the other 5 days. Starving children were beaten for catching and eating insects, and the entire compound was infested with scabies, probably because of the no soap thing. Followers were sworn to absolute poverty, chastity, and obedience, and slept directly on the floor. Strict silence was observed at all times to avoid breaking the 9th commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. All of this this fatigue, hunger, and faith led to a blind obedience. As 2000 approached, the group prepared for the world to end, as did all of us who had Y2K parents. But when the apocalypse didn't come, leaders proposed a new date of March 17th of 2000. Yup, this banana beer loving bitch really chose St. Patrick's Day. After holding a night-long vigil where members drank 70 crates of soft drinks and slaughtered 3 bulls, more than 530 people shaved their heads, clipped their nails, burned all of their belongings, and put on matching green and white uniforms. Fredonia summoned them to a rough-built church she called an ark, which was already lined with 1,000 liters of gasoline. Members gathered inside, and the cult leaders nailed the doors and windows shut from the outside, and then set the building on fire. Every single person was killed in that massive explosion. But Joseph and Credonia were not inside the building, and neither was their squad of enforcers. At this point, police believed that they had slipped away into the neighboring Congo, but they never once searched for them, and they remain at large. In the weeks following the fire's investigation, Ugandan authorities traced the cult's activities, leading to the discovery of multiple mass graves within branch compounds. More than 1,000 additional bodies across Uganda's countryside were found, and over half of them were children. It appears that most victims were killed in the months preceding the fires through rations laced with fast-acting poison. Some victims were killed through more violent methods when poisoning wasn't fast enough for Credonia's liking. While searching Credonia's residence, investigators ended up finding the bodies of 6 burly men dissolving in sulfuric acid. Police speculate that these were the men responsible for enforcing all of the strict rules and carrying out the barbaric orders of leadership, including the fire. Police also confirmed that the death toll is actually much higher than reported, but admit that there's no money and really no public interest to dig up other known grave sites on those compounds. Now, more than 2 decades later, the site of the fire has been repurposed into a tea plantation, but the hundreds of victims have never been formally remembered. One woman who lost her mom and her siblings in the fire later said, "We pray for our people on our own. We bear our pain in silence." To this day, not a single person has been prosecuted for the mass assassination of all of these forgotten Ugandan people. So feel free to whip out this little history lesson next time someone tries to crawl up your ass about putting the 10 Commandments back in school. If you enjoy hearing stories like this where you can learn and laugh a little, you'll definitely want to check out my Culture Shock playlist. My personal favorites are the Demon Slayer cult and a recent one I did on the Twin Flames universe. And both of those stories are murder-free if you need a little breather. I also have badass merch now, and that's honestly the best way to support creators like me. And right before you live, laugh, or leave a cult, declare a thumb war with that like button if you haven't already. And while you're doing that, I think I need to go soak my brain in bleach.